But look, there were lots of changes last year, obviously, with the introduction of SERPO, which is what I call the Coronavirus Economic Response Omnibus Act.
Does anybody else call it that, or just you?
Have you heard it take off? Have you heard anyone else say SERPO?
The vibe. Not quite.
Look, let's just quickly talk about the thresholds, because during what was first going to be, I think, a 6-month period and then was extended past September through to 31 December, was those changes to the statutory minimum thresholds for issuing both a bankruptcy notice, which went from $5,000 to $20,000, and under the Corporations Act, a statutory demand, which went from $2,000 to $20,000 as well. The timeframes changed as well. Those 21-day periods under both of those acts was pushed out to 6 months, that the debtor or the respondent company had to comply with the notices. So 31 December rolls round, and the statutory demands have gone back to $2,000 as the minimum threshold. But bankruptcy notices, no longer $20,000, but they have been upped from $5,000 to $10,000. So that's something that is here to stay, it seems. What do you think about that?
I think it's a fair point. I think that there was a few media pieces a couple of years ago in terms of personal bankruptcies that were going through for sort of not that much over $5,000, costing a lot more than that. Obviously, the filing fees for bankruptcy as well are significant. Yeah. So, it's not an easy thing for creditors just to decide to file. It's an expensive process, a relatively expensive process. And there were certain creditors, though, that would do it as a matter of course, whether or not that was to set an example or just as part of their debt recovery process. And they were criticised heavily for that. And I think that following on from that, there were a few internal changes that they then decided not to go as hard on those smaller debts, and they put sort of some self-imposed thresholds in place. And we saw a change in the lead up to COVID in terms of those creditors actually, which were a lot of the consumer creditors. So they were people, sort of consumer debts. There wasn't a lot of complex bankruptcy matters there, and they increased their sort of internal thresholds. So I think that there won't be a huge amount of change experienced from the increase in the threshold. I personally don't see a huge amount of bankruptcies for a petitioning creditor's debt under $10,000 or $20,000. So I don't know that that's going to change.
No.
The sort of work that comes out to registered trustees. So as we know, the official trustee takes, the vast majority of bankruptcies and most of the consumer bankruptcies. So that might impact the number of bankruptcies that is seen by the official trustee. But I think as well that the corporate threshold is incredibly low and has been lower than the bankruptcy threshold for quite some time. And there doesn't seem to be any change on the horizon there, which I find quite perplexing.
It's just strange that they would do one and not the other. There's a real disconnect there. And I agree, $2,000 is a ridiculous amount of money to, force a company into liquidation. Often it's a sign of other problems, and perhaps there's a whole world of hurt behind that $2,000 and a lot of other debt. And similarly with bankruptcy, a $5,000 debt is just not. It's just not high enough. I'm happy with the increase to $10,000. I think that it will limit some of the smaller end of town from issuing those bankruptcy notices as a debt recovery tool, which they're not supposed to do, but they do it anyway. And I'd like a similar rise in the statutory demand minimum threshold as well, to be perfectly honest. So stay tuned. Maybe that will happen soon.
Maybe.
When ASIC catches up to AFSA.
One thing I'd like to raise, though, and some people don't realise, that whilst that threshold's in place for creditors making debtors bankrupt, so you need it in terms of making a debtor bankrupt if you're applying for their bankruptcy as a creditor, there is no threshold for an individual to become bankrupt. So provided that they're insolvent, and that might only be by a minimal amount, then an individual can actually file for bankruptcy without having to worry about any of those thresholds. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion around that.
Yes. Yeah. So it's the limit for the issuance of the bankruptcy notice. And similarly to that, well, you've talked about voluntary bankruptcy. If you're a creditor, there are other acts of bankruptcy under the Bankruptcy Act, which are prescribed by Section 40. That would trigger an act of bankruptcy if not complied with. So have a little look at that if you don't have a debt that exceeds the $10,000.